Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Kara and Sasha and everyone else who helped organize this wonderful festival. Today I'm really excited to talk to you about an interest that's been one of mine for a number of decades now. And that is advertising and editorial lettering, specifically from mid-20th century American magazines and the folks that made that happen. For me, magazine ads were one of my earliest introductions to hand lettering and really design overall. I was fascinated by the seemingly endless variety of letter forms that I found in the pages of these crumbling old magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and the like, Family Circle. It seemed as though these letters could express ideas without the aid even of illustrations or photography. Some of the letters were much more conservative. Other ones were more playful. They always seemed to be entertaining, and many of them were also just very familiar to me somehow. And I became captivated by the hand lettering of this era between the 1930s and 50s or 60s or so. Today I want to share with you a history of advertising and editorial lettering from mid-20th century American magazines. It's kind of my history, and I want to share that with you today. I want to share with you some of my heroes that I came to know, and just share with you some of my favorite pieces. Now, this presentation is the result of a lot of personal research, lots of interviews that I've done with letters that I'm going to share with you today, and I've also got a lot of help from the families of the letters that I'm going to introduce you to. So I really want to thank them as well. Now, the magazine ads from this time, they not only help to ask very important questions, like this one. Think about it. I mean, how long has it been since you've tasted real cheese, okay? But the ads really, they just introduced me to a lot of cool letter forms. So when I did a little bit more digging, and I went back prior to the 1930s and 40s, this ad is from 1910. And I noticed that the ads demanded a lot more from the readers. They were much more text-heavy. They often had simply set headlines. Often you would get a stylized signature like this, a little bit of lettering. As we move forward into the 20s and 30s, we find that handwriting was, although these examples might look like they were dashed off rather quickly, it couldn't be any further from the truth. Actually, these were painstakingly drawn. But the hand lettering was used, and this particular variety is called freestyle. They were used to add some warmth and personality to the advertisements of that era. Now, the freestyle letter was often combined with graphic devices. So the one in the upper right-hand corner that you see there was affectionately referred to as a fried egg. You actually, if you thumb through any of these old magazines, you'll see this was quite popular in the 1930s, 40s, and even into the 50s. Another graphic device that was really popular was a comic strip. In the industry, they were referred to as continuities. And so they really mimic what you would expect from a comic strip. You would have a mention of the product, but it was often and usually very small, like you see in the lower right-hand corner here. We'll find out as the decades progress that the inverse is true. Actually, the graphic device of the comic strip becomes reduced, kind of deconstructed and reinterpreted. Now, there were guidelines for the use of comics and continuities. This is from J. Walter Thomson newsletter from the 1940s. This comes from the Duke University archives. So you notice there are a couple hints here. Don't try to be cute or funny. Don't offend good taste. Don't have talking animals. I will probably show you ads that violate every one of these rules, like this one. So if you're wondering if I've chosen like the most shocking or provocative ads just to get that very response, you would be absolutely right. But you can see here that the comic strip is being deconstructed. Now, instead of a series of panels, there's one panel, and the word balloon in the text becomes elevated to the headline. The letter style that would have been in the balloons was stylized, and what was created was called the brush letter. And here we see it. Really, that is the only thing that survives now from the comic strip device is simply the balloon and the brush letter until we get to the end of the 40s and we see that the balloon isn't even used, but yet this brush letter that comes from the history of comic strips and other influences survives. I really get the sense that women love to clean back in the day here. In preparation for my presentation, I did double check this with my wife. She assures me that this is not true, right? Okay, just want to get that out there. So comic strips were really big business. They were marketed to professionals, and instruction books were marketed to professionals, like this one. But it was also understood that you could, a person could not only develop this as a hobby, but then actually enter commercial art using this comic strip device. So this is an instruction book from 1936. I've had this for many years, and the face, this guy's face, just, I knew that I saw it somewhere before, and I'm not sure. My research assistant's still checking into that, but sorry, I got off topic there. There were lettering studios that did specialize in comic strips and continuities right here in the city and throughout the States. And this letter style, the brush letter that I mentioned, it also has a sister style, if you will, brush script lettering in which the letters are connected. They were often executed with this brush. Well, not this brush, but this variety of brush. This is a Winsor Newton Series 7 Kolinsky Sable. And this was the go-to lettering brush for folks doing this style of letter. So you can execute the non-connecting brush letter, but you can also create the connecting brush script letter with this particular brush. Now, oftentimes people see ads from this period and they think that these headlines were executed very quickly and then put to bed, and that was the end of it, on to the next headline. But again, as I mentioned before, with the others that I showed, it couldn't be further from the truth. Many write-outs were often done, the best parts were selected and then pieced together. This technique was also done for the non-connecting brush letter. You didn't have to use a brush, though, to make these. And the cool thing about people who are working in the early to mid-20th century advertising field, the letterers, they were very innovative. So you had, or you see, different tools being manipulated for various purposes. So on the left, there's a ruling pen that has been mitered or filed, in which you can get a brush-like type of appearance. And Frank Connolly was a letterer who was very fond of taking speedball pens and filing the round nibs to create different shapes. So again, those could be used for brush script or brush letter. Now, the type founders of the day were not lost on the popularity of the brush letter, and you probably are familiar with these typefaces, which come from this period. We have Trafton's cartoon from 1936 and Kaufman's balloon just a few years later from 1939. And they did get a certain amount of play, so if you go through these magazines, you'll see them used in advertisements and editorials, but it didn't mean that there wasn't work to go around for letterers. So here's a brush letter, which arguably is much more expressive. We also get the bonus of a fried egg right there, which is nice. Usually not with cakes, that's not how I would do it, but these are examples from Pete Dombresian, so you might be familiar with the name Pete Dom. These are from the early 50s. Pete Dom took this letter style, this very expressive brush letter, and he turned it into a film alphabet. So essentially, he adapted this letter style for film headlines. So film lettering was a means of making headlines by working from a pre-drawn set of characters and then by photographic means setting headlines. And from his work with this particular brush letter, he created the Pete Dom series. So this is from 1950. You might be more familiar with what came after that in 1952, which is Dom Casual. Now, the interesting thing here, and I have to thank John Downer for pointing this out to me, is that this particular letter style existed first as a film lettering style and then was cast in metal type, Dom Casual. It's usually the other way around. It's usually that older technologies are then adapted to newer ones. But this is kind of interesting because it went just the opposite. Photo lettering was one of the biggest film lettering houses. They were based right here in the city. This is one of their mammoth catalogs. They worked with many letterers in the city and abroad in the United States, but most of them right here in New York City. One of the most famous is Tommy Thomson, and you might, for the lettering geeks out there, you might be familiar with the script letter. Now, although this was instructional in nature, he really delved into the history of the letter forms that he was discussing, and he attempted to connect contemporary letter styles with historical models. So these models are from the 17th and 18th century, and they seem to make sense when you go through the Coulet and the Bâtard. I'm sorry, my French is really bad, so I apologize to any native French speakers out there. I'm still working on how to properly pronounce croissantwich. I just haven't figured that one out yet. If we look at the ronde at the bottom, that one's the most curious. It doesn't seem like the example on the left that Thomson is attempting to link to historical models actually matches the exemplar. And this kind of stumped me for some time. Here's an example from his book published in 1939. It wasn't until I stumbled across an example of the ronde in use. So here we actually see the ronde outside of this context of being an exemplar and someone actually using it. And now it's much easier to make that connection between what he's calling a ronde and the historical sources. I just think it's really cool to see it like in a Camel cigarette ad, like 270 years later. Another book that really made an impression on me was this one by Mortimer Leach. You might be familiar with this book as well if you're interested in lettering. Mortimer Leach taught at the Art Center in Los Angeles. He was the teacher and mentor to Doyle Young, who you might be familiar with. Before I had kind of figured out lettering, I thought that perhaps if I just tried to kind of absorb the essence, the persona, the aura of these letterers, that I too would be able to unravel its secrets. I found out it doesn't really work that way, unfortunately. So I said, all right, forget that. I'll grow my beard back and get to work here. I want to introduce you to a couple hand letterers. The first one is Tony Bonagura. He might be my favorite letterer who worked in brush script. We'll find out in a moment that he did or worked in a lot of other styles. He was born in New York City. He worked in Chicago for some time, and then he returned to New York. He actually attended Cooper Union, as I understand, at least for a short period. I would not be able to share this information without the help of the Bonagura family, specifically Jason Bonagura and Gloria Zinmeister, so I want to thank them. And with their help, I was able to identify pieces of lettering that Tony had done. This is very difficult because letterers did not sign their work. Unlike illustrators or photographers, they rarely got credit. As you can see from these examples, he was very expressive, particularly in his brush script lettering. He wasn't I wouldn't call him a technician. He wasn't very technically minded, but I think if he were, it would lose some of the spirit that he certainly captures in his lettering. This is a unique example here, a spread for which he did the lettering and actually the comp that went along with it. So finding these things nowadays is a little tough, so I'm very happy to be able to share this with you today. He didn't only do brush lettering, he did lots of other varieties of letter styles, like this semi-formal script and a more formal one, which, much to the chagrin of penmanship folks, was often referred to as Spencerian lettering. If you ever want to get into sort of like a heated debate with people online, just bring up Spencerian in reference to lettering and then just watch all the Spencer aficionados crawl out of the woodwork to let you know that that's not cool. He took some of his letter styles and, together with his partner Frank Bartuska, created what they were positioning as a rival to photo lettering. They used real film lettering techniques. They called it custom lettering. But they realized they couldn't compete, and it was ultimately absorbed by photo lettering. Now, Bonagura ended his, or I should say ended, but his career began to wane, at least in terms of advertising lettering in the 1940s and 50s, and he turned to painting. And that he was very skilled when it came to still lifes and very realistic painting, but he also did a lot of abstract work. And I like to think of this as a fried egg, kind of like coming back with his, later fine art. Another artist of the period, is Herb Feuerhake. So I talked to Ed Benguet about Herb, and you know when Ed calls someone old school, that they're old school, right? So Herb was born in 1911. He passed away in 1982. And I want to thank Amelia from the Carey collection at RIT for a lot of this information. Herb was probably most well known for the energetic brush script that appeared in Mercury ads from the late 40s and early 50s. And you can understand why this is so appealing, and he was just so skilled. He actually complained of imitators, and he even attempted to protect his work. I believe he met with either the Type Directors Club or the Art Directors Club, but nothing really came of that. He did continue to use brush lettering throughout his career, and he really was quite innovative in the way that he executed it. I mean, this is something that's really kind of off the beaten trail when you talk brush script lettering. However, he was very adept, and he was very skilled in other styles as well, as evinced by this promotional sample. He was no stranger to flourishes. So he was, he was very well-rounded. And then later in his career, when some other styles became popularized, he wasn't shy about diving into those too. And this is a nice little rare example of a sketch of his work from the Carey Collection archive. So the last letter I want to introduce you to is Ruth Guzik. I'm, again, very grateful to Ruth's family, particularly her son Jason, who was really helpful with providing imagery that I could share with you today. So here's the thing about Ruth. She was born in 1932. She passed away just a few years ago in 2011. I never met her in person, but I had the pleasure of interviewing her by phone several times. I was doing research for an article in Communication Arts about casual script, and through my exploits and whatnot on the internet, I came across her name, and it turns out that she worked for the biggest ad lettering studios in New York City between the 1950s, 60s, 70s. She worked with Julian Mansfield, Sam Marsh, Morris Glickman, people that if you're aware of the history, you know that these folks are no joke. I was first introduced to her work when I was a kid. So I grew up in the 70s, and I'm not ashamed to admit that my favorite soda was Mountain Dew. Kids, no Mountain Dew, okay? But this is how I first encountered her work, even though I didn't know it at the time. She had actually redrawn the Mountain Dew logo for Morris Glickman's studio in the 1960s. And it seems she did a fair bit of this work. This isn't the only letter style that she worked within, but like, how great is that? She did much more conservative work. In fact, most of her portfolio seems to be what would be referred to as meat and potatoes work, more sort of practical, approachable letter styles. If you're curious, this is pastel on the other side of visualizing paper, better known as tracing paper. And she would use this to transfer onto a board to ink the final work. As far as I can tell, these are the first drafts. So think about that for a minute. And here it is. It's not ad lettering per se, but in the final application. Ruth, as I mentioned, she was very skilled. She actually worked in many different letter styles. The only thing she said that she told me personally she did not do is brush letter and brush script. She worked in another studio, Julian Mansfield's studio, and a fellow named Harold Kovac handled that sort of stuff. But she could tackle just about anything else. And this is how good she was. Back in the 1950s, she complained that she wasn't being paid equally as compared to the men that were working in the office. Yes, and I wanted to make a point, I wanted to point this out. She called BS on it, and she walked out. And she was very quickly welcomed back into the studio with a pay increase. So if you've ever met her, again, I never have, but just having spoken to her, you'd know the kind of lady that she was. Really very cool. So when she worked for Julian Mansfield between 1953 and 1957, they handled the editorial lettering that you see here. And much of this was in collaboration, so oftentimes Mansfield would do some pencils or some roughs, but she was what's called the finished letterer. So that was the person who executed it for reproduction, as opposed to a comp letterer who was just doing the sketches that would then be worked up by someone to actually refine it. but an incredibly, incredibly skilled woman, and I'm so grateful to be able to share her work with you today. The legacy of these people, of these artists, endures. These are just a few of the folks working today that I really like. So if you're interested in seeing lettering somewhat along these lines, you can see that these folks who are sort of carrying the torch forward. You probably, if you're familiar with House Industries, you know that we're no stranger to influence of lettering from this era. So it no doubt feeds into many of the projects that we do. This one for the Jimmy Kimmel Live show. And this was an award that was done for the Detroit Autorama. Actually, it was done for the Henry Ford. They award this for the most innovative hot rodder at the Detroit Autorama. And so this is this is absolutely that freestyle script coming back to inform this particular piece. Now, it's true, we really like this more expressive, fluid type of lettering, but we also recognize that letters, again, did more of that meat and potatoes type of stuff. Letters were often fond of correcting typefaces. So if they had to create a headline in a Futura style, excuse me, if anyone is not here from the United States, I'm saying Futura. So just in case you're wondering, there's no CH in there, but I'm just gonna go with that. Letters, if they had to letter a headline in the Futura style, they would correct all the things they didn't like about it. And from this emerged these kind of nuances in the lettering, and so the folks at House and I are working on this typefaces that is attempting to capture some of those things. We recently had an exhibit it's actually running right now at the Henry Ford Museum, and as you can imagine, many of these inspirational pieces that I showed you today, and just lettering in general from this genre, from this era, are informing in this case, the banner signage at our exhibit, and this one as well. So an upright brush script. This is the sort of the motto of the exhibit: learn from what you like and apply it to what you do. And looking back at my interest in hand lettering of this era, that's exactly what I tried to do. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.